I don't know. Where'd that cord go? There it is. Ooh, I'm stretching the lengths of my cord. All right. Hey, so Carlos, do you know what's going on? Okay, all that stuff's over there. There's sticky notes kind of telling you what to do. Harry couldn't figure it out though. Hey, so chapter 25 is about the Great Depression. It's also about the rest of the 1930s. During the 1930s, there's a lot going on in the world. Like Hitler comes to power in Germany. The Japanese are taking over parts of China and Korea and stuff like that. But most of the focus and most of the confusing parts of this chapter are the stuff about the Great Depression. Okay, so we're going to start with the causes of the Great Depression, and it's important to look at this causes of the Great, like a very simple view is the stock market crashed, and then we had a depression. Right? And that's part of it. But the stock market should be viewed more as a symptom of a weak economy than a cause of the depression. Especially back then, not that many Americans' personal finances were tied into the stock market. More Americans were tied to the stock market through, they might work for General Motors, and if General Motors stocks go bad, then that is harmful to those individuals who work there, like they might lose their job or something like that. The stock market wasn't, the stock market, you should see it as an indicator. Does that make sense? In the same way that the fever isn't going to kill you, it's the infection that's causing the fever. You guys get what I mean? Okay, I don't think you die from fever, do you?
You can.
Okay, you could just boil. Your cells could boil.
Well, once your cells reach a certain temperature, they can't function.
All right. Really?
That's why you're hospitalized when you're on 105 or higher.
Really? I didn't know that. What? All right, cool. Anyways, so the stock market crash was more of a symptom of a weak economy than a cause of the depression. And so we should look at what those weaknesses were in the economy at the time. The biggest one, and we saw this in the last chapter, and I tried to emphasize it, was that growing gap between the rich and the poor. When economies are doing well, they have a solid middle class, and that solid middle class makes enough money that they can participate in the economy. If the vast majority of the population is too poor to go out to dinner or too poor to buy a new dishwasher or those sorts of things, then the businesses that supply those services aren't going to function. And as we saw, a growing gap between the wealthiest Americans and the poorest Americans, America didn't have the buying power to continue to support all those big companies, right? The second thing is a dramatic increase in personal debt. And I use the word dramatic here. The book, if you're looking for something fun to read this weekend, I had a little book. I have a little book that's over there, but I can't go get it right now because I got a cord on me. It's a very short introduction to the New Deal and the Great Depression. And in it, the professor Eric Rockway talks about how in the beginning of the 1920s, the average personal debt was went up $4 a year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but remember, dollars were a lot bigger deal back then. Good question, and I don't know. But at the end of the 1920s, the average personal debt was going up $14 a year. So it tripled and a halved. Right? That's a big gain. I don't know what the dollars mean, but the fact that everybody has a little bit more debt, it means everybody's flying a little bit closer to ruin. The more debt you have, the just closer you are to things falling apart, right? If you're already in debt, if you're not in debt, you got a little money in the bank and you get fired from your job, you've got a little bit of a cushion. You can live, right? But if you're already like in debt and the bank's calling you every day and all that kind of thing, and then you lose your job, it makes things a lot worse, right? And so more and more Americans were without any kind of cushion. And of course, if you have a dramatic increase in personal debt and everybody's got it, what's that going to do to people's spending habits? It's going to lower their spending habits, right? And so people are spending less, which makes those big businesses making less money and all that kind of thing. Another thing that is one of the weaknesses in the economy was all these corporate mergers. When you guys know what a monopoly is. when one business owns all of a market, right? So one company owns all the gas stations or something like that. Oligopoly is when a few own all those companies. The best example of this is the auto industry, which in a way it's more efficient to not have 500 different car manufacturers, right? But when you get to the point where you've only really got 3 major car manufacturers, if all 3 of those aren't, well, for starters, when there are only 3 major car manufacturers, the natural ways that supply and demand set prices get manipulated then. Does that make sense? Like if there are fewer businesses selling the same products, then the market doesn't have the flexibility to really point out inefficiencies. You know what I mean? If somebody came along right now and started selling a cell phone that was $100 but did everything that your fancy $600 cell phone did, that would be pointing out an inefficiency in the cell phone market. Does that make sense? That innovation points out inefficiencies. Rather than having those innovations pointing out inefficiencies, big companies were buying up smaller companies, and those efficiencies were hidden. And so when there were flaws in stock prices and all that kind of thing, you couldn't see them. We've discussed how like farming and capitalism don't really go together, because the more efficient you are as a farmer, the more you hurt yourself, because you grow more crops, which lowers the price of crops, and so that cycle keeps on going. You guys see how that would work? And there was also, during this time, massive corruption in the stock market. It was basically unregulated. Some of that was just straight up insider trading. What that means is that if I know that we're gonna open a new store tomorrow, and that's gonna make my business more valuable, and I tell my friend Katie that we're opening a new store tomorrow, and she buys stocks down here, and then all of a sudden they jump up, then that's corruption on my part, right? Insider trading. I'm not supposed to tell her that. That one's really hard to stop from happening because people talk, right? But still, those sorts of corruptions, and there are far more complex ways. Just people were manipulating stock prices in a way that wasn't based on supply and demand. It was based on how can we get rich. A good example of that is called stock pooling. Okay, so part of the reason that Catherine buys a stock is she's reading the newspaper or reading the little stock ticker thing, and she sees that Windmaster Corner stocks keep going up and up and up. Right? So she says, hey, if those stocks are going up, I'm gonna buy some now in hopes that they'll keep going up, and then I can sell them 2 weeks from now and make some money without working. That make sense? Okay, so what if Katie and Cooper and Cyrus and I bought a bunch of Windmaster stocks, and I sold my stocks to Katie for this much money, and then she sold them to Cooper for that much money, then he sold his to Cyrus for that much money, and then Cyrus sold them to me for that much money, and we were all just doing this out of the same pool of money. But we were making these transactions to make it look like the stock was just going up, 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 up. And Catherine's sitting over there in Nebraska, and she's like, look, that stock's going up, 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 I'm gonna buy now. And then she helps to raise our stock prices, because if everybody else is buying the stocks, then our prices keep on going up, and then we sell our stock to some sucker, and we've just manipulated it, right? Does that make sense? So those sorts of problems, people are just gaming the system, right? It was a form of what we would now call hacking and stuff, where you just use technologies to fool hapless victims. Yes, Cooper?
How much of that was created around now and around the Great Depression? How much of it was just a thing that became more popular?
The growth in the stock market there was massive growth in the stock market in the 1920s, in part because with World War I and the kind of collapse of those European nations that had been so horribly harmed by World War I, like the world's financial markets move to New York City. So a lot of the world's gold, everybody's on the gold system, moved from London and Paris and Berlin to New York City. Because what was going on over there, the next one is international financial instability. You remember we had loaned a bunch of people money during World War I? okay, and they needed to pay us back. So what was happening a lot in the 1920s was Germany had to pay England and France back, right? They didn't have any money, so they borrowed money from us. They gave that money to the English and the French. The English and the French still owed us money from weapon sales and stuff like that during the war. So they gave us back that money. And then we were given that, then we'd loan it out to the Germans again. And it was just a cycle of the same money. And most of it was ending up in the United States. When all that gold ends up here, people are like, hey, what can I do with this gold that I have? And they invest it in the stock market. So there's inflation in the amount of capital that's coming to the United States in the pockets of bankers, which falsely inflates the stock market. And so, because there's all that money in the stock market now, people are like, hey, how can I scam this deal, right? So I think a lot of that scamming does start in the 20s. Yeah, and some of it is like, hey, now more and more people have telephones, so we're more able to like call up our friend and scam people. You know what I mean? Like, you guys are smart about the internet and cell phones and all that, but if you try and trick my mother-in-law with some sort of Nigerian prince email, you could probably do it. You know what I mean? You get what I'm saying? It's the same sort of thing, I think. I think this is a Nigerian prince situation. Also, one of the big problems, though, was that because people kept seeing the stock market going up and up and up, if Eva's sitting there and she's got some personal debt, she's like, how am I going to make this up? And she knows friends who keep making money on the stock market. Then she's like, hey, if I could just pick the right stock, I could solve my personal debt problems. So she borrows some money and and speculates. She gambles, basically, except it's not in a casino, it's on the stock market, that borrowed money in hopes that she'll make up that debt that she already has. Does that make sense? Yes, sir. You gonna go? Okay, cool. It's nice to see you, Robert. And so buying on margin is buying stocks with borrowed money. And the thing is that if you, like, the way it's supposed to work is, I have a job, I feed my family, I pay my bills and everything, and if I've got a few $100s left over at the end of the month, maybe I'll invest it in the stock market, right? And then if those stocks go bad, I can still feed my family and pay my mortgage and all that stuff. That's the way it's supposed to work. You invest money that's a little bit extra, right? People were saying, no, because the stock market keeps going up and it's never going to stop going up, I'm going to borrow money so that I can buy stocks with that because it will increase. But if you're borrowing that money, as soon as prices start to go down, you still have to make your monthly payments on those loans, right? So you got to sell right away. So it sets up, it's setting up for a panic. You guys see how that happens? And the stock market crash of 1929 was the biggest panic that we had. As we saw, this is not an attempt to take a jab at the president right now, but as we saw, because this is totally different financial times, but as people saw some of these symptoms in the economy, they said, hey, we better raise tariffs. That ended up harming making things worse, because by setting up those tariffs, the Germans couldn't repay like other countries couldn't repay their bills because we were the only ones buying things, and it caused problems internationally that came back to bite us. So that's all those causes, right? Did I say the words Herbert Hoover during all that? Yes, Cooper. I'm going to stand here.
Causes, right?
Sure, yes. I'm just trying to stay where people can see.
Are these all related, or was it just chance that these all happened at the same time and it was a perfect storm kind of deal?
They're all related in that they're all exacerbated by the fact that there's this growing gap between the rich and the poor, and the rich are playing with the money of the nation at this point. That's the biggest factor. The other factor is lack of regulation. And so we find a lot of the response to the depression is, whoa, these people have been messing with the economy. Like there was a lot of scamming going on and stuff like that. Yeah. Okay. So Herbert Hoover becomes president in March of 1929. And the stock market crash, as you know, is in October of 1929. And so you can't really blame that stuff on Herbert Hoover, but his response to the depression was inadequate. And this made things a lot worse. And historians generally I mentioned this in a couple classes last time, they put him in on the list of worst presidents as a general rule. If you just read chapter 24, Herbert Hoover sounds like Wonder Boy, right? He's doing everything. He's the Secretary of the Commerce. He sounds like the smartest guy in the world. He's a good-looking dude. People seem to like him. He's damn good-looking. See what I did there? Because there's a Hoover Dam. I don't know. He was an engineer, and it's named after him because of his engineering skills, I think, not because of his presidency. Also, the road to Newberg, Oregon is called the Herbert Hoover Highway because he once lived in Newberg. Who knew? Anyways, it's not all his fault. The main thing is he lacks some of the basic information about the economy that we kind of take for granted nowadays. There's a chart in your book that shows horrible unemployment numbers, like unemployment numbers up around 25% of American workers being unemployed in 1933. But that chart is information like that history archaeologists dug up later. He didn't have that real-time information to tell him how bad things were. He'd read in the newspaper, oh, a plant laid off 100 people in Toledo, Ohio, but he didn't know nationwide that all these people were losing their jobs, right? So it's hard for him to gauge what a federal government response would be. Also, you need to recognize that this is before we really had federal government responses to things, right? Theodore Roosevelt would make a law here and there about tainted meat and that kind of thing, but there weren't massive programs that were nationwide programs sponsored by the federal government. So that wasn't really in his mindset. Especially it wasn't in the Republican mindset because they'd been going laissez-faire all of the 1920s. He didn't really know much about unemployment, about how much, like the stuff I've been telling you about what people's debt rates were and how much money people, like their wages were going down. So he didn't really have a great understanding of this gap between rich and poor that was the problem. So you can't really blame him for a lot of that stuff. So when the stock market crash occurs, he's like, okay, this is another one of those panics. We read about it every 2 chapters, right? Every 20 years. They come like clockwork. And what's happened in the past is a few people, this sounds horrible, but some people starve. And then the economy eventually bounces back. We hadn't really had a massive national government response to any of our previous economic crashes. And so he was thinking that it was just another one of those. It was a lot worse. And he couldn't tell. So his plan, and this sounds so lame because it's kind of lame, his plan was voluntarism. And you can just see him in his fancy little suit saying, I call for voluntarism. And what this means is it's not the government's job to help people, but other people should help their family or their neighbors voluntarily. So if Arleth is hungry, she shouldn't get money from the federal government to buy food. She should go down to the fish food bank or to her church, or her neighbors should, hook her up with some apples or whatever they grow, those sorts of things, right? And Arleth's business should pledge not to lay her off, or at least keep her, cut everybody's hours from 40 hours a week to 30 hours a week, but don't lay anybody off or something like that, And this is how communities can voluntarily make things work, right? And this sounded stupider to me in high school than it does now, because I lived in a city where people didn't, city life is different, right? But in this town, I can see people saying, yeah, we're going to band together and we're going to do this. We do that stuff all the time.
Probably make more food than they do.
Probably, yeah, but this was back in the day when there were more farmers and all that kind of thing. And so, I can see how, Herbert Hoover, who had lived in Newberg, Oregon, which is a lot like Hood River, Oregon, would say, yeah, just the communities will take care of it. But it was so bad, and he didn't know this because he didn't have that information. He also, this is another one of those places where personality matters. I told one of the classes last time that Herbert Hoover, one of the things he thought was he needed to show America that everything was okay. And do you guys remember how he showed them everything was okay? Who was that? He and his wife were served a 5-course dinner every night in the White House in formal attire, in a tuxedo and a formal gown and silver trays and all that. That way Americans would know everything's okay, because the president can't be hungry or anything like that, right? And he thought this was a good idea, like this is how you lead, which is, I think, the totally It's a horrible idea, isn't it? But you can see how somebody might think, oh yes, they must be worried about me. I'm the symbol of America. That's something that Marie Antoinette would think. But yeah, so he also called his role, and you got to think of this in the context of laissez-faire and people saying the government needs to stay out of the economy. He saw his role as a cheerleader for the economy. I don't mean to insult cheerleaders. I know they're athletic and all that kind of thing, but in this instance, he's describing someone who sits on the sideline and just yells. I'm not insulting cheerleaders, okay? But he called himself a cheerleader, not a player, not a coach or a referee. None of those things. He was just there to say, "Go America, go," in his tuxedo, right? And so hi Owen.
Hi.
What's up? There are all kinds of things here. What kind of thing are you thinking about? There is a blue folder back on this table, but look around over here. And you can look on my desk too. You thought it was the other Owen? Yeah. Yeah, okay. That's Owen Somerset. All right, he did. Not as in-depth though. Anyway, he thought he was a cheerleader. Does that make sense? And so he doesn't see his role as being an active one. He's a passive observer. He's a passive observer. And he lacked a common touch. I think that's clear. And one of the things, and it's over on the chapter, one of the big things that kind of makes everybody understand that Hoover is just not a good president is the bonus army. After World War I, American soldiers who came home from the war weren't really given a bonus. They were promised a bonus, I think it was in 25 years. Because, the economy, we didn't have a whole lot of money, supposedly, at the end of World War I to pay soldiers. So they said, okay, you'll get a bonus, but it's not going to be until 43, right? But Americans are starving in 1932. So a bunch of former soldiers who served in World War I, support our troops, all that kind of thing, they form what's called the bonus army. And they're not armed or anything, but they go, kind of like Coxey's army, you remember going to Washington, D.C.? They go to Washington to say, hey, just give us our bonus now, right? They feel like they've earned this bonus. They put their lives on the line for America, all that kind of thing. Hoover hides in the White House and won't listen to them. And Hoover calls out the Marines. He gets General Douglas MacArthur to lead a bunch of Marines down to the lawn, the White House lawn where these soldiers are. The Marines overreact. They bring in tanks. There are fires set. These American soldiers are like driven off of the White House lawn through combat methods, right? And this was all Hoover's doing. And it's him showing, like, all Americans were like, oh my God, if he's doing this. And by now we had the newsreels at the beginning of the movies where you could see what was happening and all. And so this video footage, Americans were seeing this, and it was like, oh my God, the president's attacking American veterans. This isn't good at all. And so that was in 1932 during the election. The textbook quotes somebody writing a letter to Hoover saying, you should vote for Roosevelt and make it unanimous, which I think is funny because like, he was the only one who was going to vote for Hoover. In the 1932 election, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected president, and he begins what's called the New Deal. You remember Theodore Roosevelt had the Square Deal? And I think I say this I say this, you guys can bear with it. Most of the time I try not to get too deep into personalities, but part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's ability to reach the American people is, part of his success is his ability to reach the American people. As a young man, FDR was, he contracted polio when he was about 30, which left him in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And so there's a picture of him over there underneath Chewbacca and everybody in his wheelchair. That's a rare picture of him in his wheelchair. A lot of the time you'll see him, like if you watch the videos that I'm going to link to on my teacher page, he does this a lot, this kind of thing. They like prop him against something and leave him there, which probably could have led to assassinations, like he couldn't run away or anything. I've never thought of that before.
Stand up and just walk.
Yeah, and you'll see him with like a cane and doing one of these things, but a lot of the time, like there's a picture of him up there by Freud, and he's in a car, and they get him in spots where, you know, he's sitting down, but he's looking kind of active and those sorts of things, right? That's the FDR pictures. But I think there is an element of compassion that comes from him being in a wheelchair for that period of his life, that I think he has more understanding of people than somebody else who was born to one of the richest families in America would have in these instances, right? I have a couple quotes up here that are important. I didn't look this one up again, so it might not be word for word, but it's close enough. And it sounds stupid. Yes, Cooper?
Wait, he's a Roosevelt, though. He was born to one of them.
He was, yeah, he totally was. But he's also in a wheelchair, yeah. And I think that means something. So Roosevelt, when he becomes president, he says, we must try something. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else. But for God's sake, try something. This sounds obvious, but this is oh crap, I'm gonna move the camera a little bit so that we can see over there, because people are just wondering what I'm pointing at. I'm pointing off the screen. Ooh. Look at that. Now we've moved on to the part 2 of the lesson. Oh yes. Anyway, I have an example of this, and I'm in no way picking a side. Actually, I guess I am picking a side, so you guys can think what you want. Often in the there's currently debates over gun laws, right? And people are saying we should have more gun laws. The people who don't want more gun laws, a lot of the time, some of their arguments are quite valid, but a lot of the time their argument is, well, that won't work, that won't work, that won't end every shooting ever. So they're like, we shouldn't have a new law because there might still be one shooting a year. You know what I mean? And people are like, politicians all the time are afraid to try anything because if it goes wrong, people are going to say, ha ha, you suck. You know what I'm saying? It's the same people in the school who point at you and laugh when your team loses a game, but they never play any sports. You know those people? And they're like, ha ha, your baseball team sucks. And it's like, what do you do? Sit around and play video games all day? But they wanna laugh at you. You know what I mean? And sometimes the person who's willing to try something, like Roosevelt's saying, hey, this is a problem. We gotta try to fix this sucker, right? And obviously not everything's gonna work, but we're gonna try some stuff. Let's throw it out there. It's kind of a can-do attitude, right? My other quote here is the most famous of the Roosevelt quotes, New Deal quotes. And I always thought it was stupid. I didn't understand this until recently. It is, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Have you heard that before? Okay. So Roosevelt said in his first inaugural address, he says, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And I always thought that was stupid. It's kind of redundant, right? But I think what he's saying here, it's an economic argument. When the economy's going bad and everybody's poor, and you don't see a very bright future, you're not going to go out and spend money, are you? And if you're not going to go out and spend money, and nobody's going out to spend money because they're all hiding in their basement with some canned goods and some bottled water, what's going to happen to the economy? It's going to get worse, right? Businesses are going to lay people off, all that kind of thing. And so fear is actually making us even more fearful. It's the fear that we have to defeat. We have to kind of stretch out there and try some stuff, man. And he's like, hey, sometimes I take my wheelchair down a hill and it's a little sketchy, but I haven't fallen out yet. I made that quote up, but you get what I mean? Yes, Cooper. He probably fell out repeatedly. Those wheelchairs sucked back then.
Yeah,
no seat belts.
I'm just saying, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Sounds like a fancy paraphrase version of one of Mr. Case's plays, Don't Panic.
You're right. Thank you very much. It is kind of a don't panic thing because it's the panic that creates the panic. Yeah. Okay, my video stopped in between sometime along the way. I think we had just finished talking about quotes and we moved on to Keynesian economics. So John Maynard Keynes is the most important economist of the 20th century. He's a British guy, and he is best known for his theories on demand-side economics, which said that government, in times of crisis, government should be the spender of last resort, which means that if the economy is going badly, the government has to start spending money. This is called being a counter-cyclical agent, because the cycle says that if the people are out of work and don't have any money and they're scared, they're not going to go out and spend. If I'm worried about the economy, I'm going to get some canned food and go down to the basement and just wait it out, right? But if I do that and I'm not out spending money in the economy, businesses aren't doing well because people like me aren't spending. And on a large scale, those businesses are going to end up dying because nobody is spending money. So what John Maynard Keynes says is the government needs to hire a bunch of Americans, and Roosevelt, following the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, says the government needs to hire a bunch of Americans, and the government is going to, and then those Americans will spend money in businesses. So if the government decides if Cyrus is out of a job, you're still out of a job, Cyrus. If Cyrus is out of a job, and Cyrus, then he's not going to be spending money, right? And that hurts the economy of Hood River. So what if the government decides, hey, we're going to build a dam on the Columbia River. We'll call it the Bonneville Dam. And we hire Cyrus to go work on that dam. Then Cyrus has a paycheck now, and Cyrus is spending money at Safeway. He's spending money at Dutch Brothers. He's spending money at different places. He might buy a new refrigerator or something like that. And all that stuff together, like his spending at Safeway keeps people employed at Safeway and keeps people on farms in America employed. His spending on that refrigerator kept a plant in Michigan alive. Those sorts of things, right? So through government spending, we're getting the economy back going again. Right? And people see Cyrus going out spending money, and they see that things are happening, and pretty soon, psychologically, people see rational behaviors instead of hunkering down in their basements, right? This is the idea of John Maynard Keynes. The phrase that he uses is priming the pump, and we don't do this nowadays. But the idea, back in the day, you get your water from a pump where you go out and you pump water out of the well, right? But the seals on those, rubber seals that kept everything airtight to make the pump work, those seals would get dry. And so in order to get the seals to stick, you would need, hi Robert, I have to retape part of it because the camera just stopped. To get the seals to work, you'd have to pour a little bit of water in there to get them wet, and that would make everything airtight, right? So this means in order to get water, you have to have a little bit of water. People would keep, a pitcher of water or something ready just for priming the pump. This is the same thing that happens with money. In order to get the money flowing through the system, somebody's got to pour a little bit of money down there at first to just start the process going, right? That's John Maynard Keynes. And this is the economic underpinnings of the New Deal. Another thing about FDR was his ability to convince, to lead, right? Mr. Fultz will say over and over again that the power of the president is the power to persuade. And what that means is that FDR had to convince Americans to take part in this new economy that he was trying to build. He did so in part through new technologies. The technology of radio he used for fireside chats, which every weekend he would give a little address to the American people over the radio. And he would ask them to sit by their fires and listen to the radio, and he would talk about things that were important going on. The best example kind of the genius of Roosevelt is the bank holiday and dealing with the bank crisis of 1933. Before he became president and early in his presidency, there was a series of bank runs in the United States. This is because banks don't keep all the money that they've taken in. They don't just keep it there. If you go down to the bank and put your paycheck in the bank, they don't go and put it in a little drawer marked Dave or something like that, right? They take that money, they loan it to somebody else. And so they don't have all the money there. But if you heard that there was something wrong at the bank, would you go down there and say, I want my cash money right now, because you're worried that the bank is going to close down? You would. And because you would, then the bank, which doesn't keep all the money right there, the bank would fail because of the concern of the people. You're welcome to erase anything on that board over there that you want to, but do so with a towel. And so there were these bank runs. One of the examples in one of the videos that I wish we could watch is of this guy he's a janitor, and he saved a couple $1,000s over the course of his life, and it was in the bank, and then he heard that the bank was going bad, so he goes down and he waits outside the bank for 2 days, and when he finally realizes he's not going to get his money, he goes home and he hangs himself, right? I know my grandfather, up until the day he died, had money in his mattress because he didn't trust banks. Either way, Roosevelt wanted to get he wanted the banks to work. And so he came up with a plan. First, he said, hey, we're going to have a bank holiday. He closes the banks, I think it was for a week. And all the banks in the United States. Then they passed the Emergency Banking Act, which pushes a couple $2 billion into American banks around the nation. And that way they've got some money there in case there's a bank run, so that they can give out the money that they need. This is, if you've ever seen It's a Wonderful Life, there's a bank run in It's a Wonderful Life, right? Anyway, then though, Roosevelt goes on the radio and he talks to the American people and he says, hey, this is how the banking system works. I know you guys don't all trust the banks or anything like that, but if we can all be calm and not run down there and ask for all our money, the banks are going to be okay because I put some extra money in there. And we're working on legislation called Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is a business, or it's a government-run business that insures deposits. Yes, Cooper?
Where did he get that money to put in the bank?
He borrowed it from the future. They sold government bonds. Yeah. And so through the FDIC, all the bank deposits were going to be insured now, which means that if I was worried about my money in the bank, if the bank failed, it had insurance, so I'd always get my money back, which means I'm not going to run down there, right? Eventually, they reopened the banks. More Americans put money into the bank than take money out of the bank because Roosevelt got them to trust it. Also, for the long haul, the FDIC has been around ever since. There's never been one claim against the FDIC because there are never bank runs, and there are never bank runs because things are insured. It's this virtuous cycle that keeps everything working together. It's brilliant, and this is Roosevelt in a nutshell. Smart, targeted legislation, not worrying about spending some government money and going a little bit into debt, great communication with the American people, and the American people responding. A lot of this lesson is about, FDR getting us out of the Depression. Really, Americans got us out of the Depression. Like, Americans kind of bonded together and did this. He led the American people. But it was the American people who did this. It was the American people who built those dams and roads and bridges and everything. It wasn't Franklin Roosevelt. Man's in a wheelchair. How is he going to build a dam? Anyway, let's move on to the next part. I'm sure people in wheelchairs can build dams.
They probably built the first wheelchairs.
They probably did.
Built them for.
I know.
But they weren't people with wheelchairs if they weren't pretty neat.
You're right. That's so chicken or egg. It was people with disabilities who built those first wheelchairs. But the first wheelchair was, by definition, built by somebody who didn't have a wheelchair.
That's true.
Yes. Okay. The cool hair edition. That's exciting. I can't wait. Hitler doesn't have cool hair.
I don't know. The fact that they put Ho Chi Minh is the second one.
So your facial hair, that's a solid beard. Yeah.
But it's so obvious which one came first.
Okay. Chewbacca does have great hair. Okay. Now, there are so many programs in this chapter that you should not try to memorize them all. However, I would separate out the programs that are in this chapter into 3 categories so that you can kind of wrap your heads around them. They are relief, reform, and recovery. I wrote a little song about this. The song is set to the 90s classic Waterfalls by TLC. You guys know that song. It goes, don't go chasing waterfalls, just stick to the river and the lakes like you're used to. And they dance in the water like this. Anyways, and one of the women in TLC is Lisa Left Eye Lopez, who tried to set her husband's sneakers on fire in the bathtub and burned their house down. That was Andre Rison, former Atlanta Falcons wide receiver. Anyway, so the song, I told you I wrote a song, but then I didn't sing the song. The song goes, relief, reform, recovery, that's how Franklin Roosevelt saved our economy. Yeah. If I were writing a quiz about this chapter, which I've done before, I would have a question that's something like, how did the Roosevelt administration provide relief to Americans? Define relief and give at least one example of relief. Relief is giving immediate aid to help to people in need, like people who are starving, give them some food or some money. The Federal Emergency Relief Act gave money to particularly women with small children so that they could have some money to feed their kids. The Emergency Banking Act pushed money into the banks to stop the bank runs. The Emergency Farm Mortgage Act provided a program. A lot of farmers were losing their farms because they couldn't pay their mortgages, so this was a way to help them delay some mortgage payments so that they could hang on to their farms. Eventually, it's later, I think it's 1935, we institute a Social Security program that provides money for old people. And this is really smart. Social Security is not just, hey, let's be nice and provide money for old people. It makes sense, because Grandpa is 72, but he's hanging on to that job down at the store. He doesn't move real fast, but he's got no income, and so the man's got to keep working, right? And nobody fires him because, he's worked there for 50 years. Wouldn't it be better if Grandpa's job went to some 20-year-old who is going to move a little bit faster and probably be a little bit better worker? And also, so Grandpa gets a Social Security check, and this young person gets a job and some job skills. We work our way up in life, and so Social Security is a smart way to spend government money. Before the New Deal, there was no old people money program. There was no there was worker compensation, but there was no unemployment insurance. Many of those safety nets that we now have were non-existent. Okay. Reform is the fixing of the structural flaws that caused this mess in the first place. So Wall Street was the wild, wild west. And so they put together the Securities and Exchange Commission that is a way to oversee Wall Street, right? The same thing with the Federal Trade Commission. The Glass-Steagall Act regulates banking so that the savings of the people are in a different part than the investment bank where they're speculating with money. So they don't take my paycheck down and gamble it on some stupid stock deal. The FDIC is an example of reforms. Maybe the most important is the Wagner Act, which protects unions' ability to bargain collectively. It's called the Union Magna Carta in the chapter. And this union jobs that are better paying are the foundation of a middle class. A middle class is the foundation of a stable economy that breaks the boom-bust cycle. And so the biggest problem, the gap between the rich and the poor, part of the way to alleviate that is make sure that unions are strong and make sure that workers can bargain for better wages collectively. So that's reform. And recovery is rebuilding the economy. That's where the Keynesian economics really comes in. This is where we hire young people to build trails and roads in wilderness areas. So the Civilian Conservation Corps hires people, for example, to go work building trails through the Grand Canyon. Those trails are still used today. This is useful stuff. But I think they paid like $30 a month or something like that, and $10 went to the worker, and then $20 went home to their family. So that money's getting spent, right? And it's a way to push money into the economy to get the money cycling again. It's priming the pump. The Works Progress Administration builds Bonneville Dam. right? That's the dam. The reason the electricity that charged the battery in the camera that I'm using right now comes from Bonneville Dam, right? This is stuff we still use today, but it was also used to recharge the economy. See what I did there? During the 1930s. We also, golly, and I can't remember the name of it was one of those programs that built Timberline Lodge. These were out-of-work artists who, they need jobs too, right? Even artists need to eat. And so they hired out-of-work artists to build Timberline Lodge, which again is still used. It's still a vital part of the Northwest economy, right? This is smart. So they build dams and electrical systems throughout the Tennessee Valley where they didn't have electricity before. So yeah, these were programs to hire Americans. But these were also things that were that we still use. It's really a brilliant combination of things. So don't get stuck on memorizing every program. Kind of get the idea of they were trying to provide relief while also reforming the economy and also pressing for recovery. That's the end of this part. It has been stopped automatically. What the hell? They probably missed the best part. I might have to do this again. Anyway, ask that question again, Cooper.
Did any of Roosevelt's New Deal just backfire and fail completely?
Yes. Some of it, let's see. Some of it was declared unconstitutional, like the Agricultural Adjustment Agency and the National Recovery Agency. The Agricultural Adjustment Agency is an interesting case, and it really didn't work that well, and it was really unpopular. So you guys know how the more farmers produce, the lower prices are? How do you stop that cycle?
Make them produce less.
You could make them produce less. And you could even take some of their production and destroy it. So the Agricultural Adjustment Agency famously took like thousands of pigs, killed them, and buried them during a time when American people were starving. Right? Now the logic, it sounds very Herbert Hoover because it's totally clueless in a lot of ways. The logic is strong though, and it was Henry Wallace who was in charge of the Agricultural Adjustment Agency, and Henry Wallace said that we couldn't continue to treat farms like they're a charity. And if they had taken those pigs and just given them out to hungry Americans, what happens to the price of pork? What happens to farmers who are still trying to sell pigs? Like the price of pork goes down, nobody can make a living selling pigs. But meanwhile, you're burying food when people are starving, which just doesn't pass the logic test, right? Eventually, because they were trying to adjust prices without allowing companies to set their own prices, that was declared unconstitutional. Same thing happened with the National Recovery Agency. So basically, I'm going to back up for a second. You know how Roosevelt said we must try something? If it doesn't work, we'll try something else? You know what he was trying? Socialism. I mean, this is socialism. Like, it's more dependence on the government. I don't have a problem with socialism personally, but a lot of Americans do. Like, we had that whole Red Scare in the 1920s and everything, and so there was a push back against some of the most socialist aspects of this. The National Recovery Agency was trying to set prices for businesses, and the courts, which were a lot more conservative because the Supreme Court they'd been around for a long time. It was an old court. They fought against a lot of this, and they won some of those battles. In 1935, when he was preparing to run for re-election, Roosevelt starts to say maybe we can cut back on some of this spending because it was expensive, right? But the economy wasn't ready for it, and so unemployment went back up and all this kind of thing. You'll see there's a chart of unemployment in the book, and you'll see a spike in about 1936. And this was because they let off the gas when they should have kept their foot on the gas. You know how you're going up a hill and you're like, oh, maybe I can leave it in second or whatever. I don't know do people drive stick shifts anymore? No. Yeah. Anyway, sometimes you need to downshift, and he should have been downshifting, but he didn't. Anyways, that analogy doesn't work for you. Maybe our listeners on the other side will like that. Timeline super fast. So Hoover becomes president right before that stock market crash. There's some foreign policy stuff here because in the next chapter we get into a war, right? It seems that Japan and Italy and Germany were attacking their neighbors during this chapter. We talked about the bonus army. That was in 1932. Franklin Roosevelt becomes president in 1933. There's a good chart of the first 100 days, and that's a phrase that they use in this when talking about Roosevelt a lot. It's like this furious, energetic time when they pass all this legislation. There's like a whole page of legislation that they passed on page 784 that you should kind of look at. It's pretty amazing. This is the first 100 days also nowadays in politics. It's the bane of every new president because nobody can do as much as Franklin Roosevelt did. And so they all look like they're incompetent compared to all the crap they got done in the 1930s, right?
Why did they get so much done in the 1930s?
Because Hoover had been so bad, and things were so bad. And back then too, you didn't become president until March. Now it's January, so people were just kind of waiting around from the time Hoover left from the election in November all the way till March. And they were like, "We better get some stuff done. We've been waiting too long." And nowadays, I don't think as much needs to be done now either. I don't think as much has ever needed to be done. Except maybe with Lincoln, but that's a different thing. So we talked about the bonus army. Most of this stuff we talked about. You can see there's like Hitler taking power in Germany at the same time, and you can see how a worldwide economic depression would lead to radical totalitarian leaders in other parts of the world, and people saying, yeah, maybe I'll follow a crazy dude like Hitler, right? Yes, Cooper?
Why was it worldwide? Is it just because so much of the world's economy is based in the U.S. right now?
Well, part of it was John Maynard Keynes said that the causes of the causes of the Great Depression are the First World War, and that it all comes out of that First World War. The United States had had a time of prosperity. Other countries hadn't really had much prosperity in the 1920s. They'd never really recovered from the war, and then when the American economy was kind of keeping them up, like that whole cycle of loans from the Americans. Then once the American economy falls apart, everything's bad.
So a lot of the time you say war is good for the economy because it borrows from the future. This is that future when you borrow money wrong.
It is, and that war is good for the economy is based on the American example where we always win the wars and they're never fought in our country. Right? And so, like, war wasn't good for the British economy in World War I because they lost 2 million of their best working class people who were the ones who would do all the work, right? Not all the work. Women work too, but it was mainly men who died. But you know what I mean? Like, it's young people.
And it was really good for us in World War II.
Yeah, I mean, economically.
Yes.
Yeah, yes, it was. But we didn't fight that one here. Right? It's different when there are bodies in your own streets. And so, yeah. Okay. We got through all this stuff. Oh, Roosevelt tries to pack the court. This was an interesting tactic. You know how he was like, damn, the Supreme Court keeps on shooting down my stuff. And the only way people leave the Supreme Court usually is if they die. Right? Because it's a lifelong thing. And so, but there's nothing and the Supreme Court right now and for most of our history has been 9 people. There's nothing in the Constitution that says 9 people. So Roosevelt was like, hey, Congress, how about we add a few Supreme Court justices? Like, so for every justice that's over 70, we bring in another justice. So that and what he was trying to do was get more liberal people who were more supportive of his things so that he'd have, instead of losing a vote 5-4, he'd win a vote 6-5 or something like that. You know what I mean? It didn't work. Congress said no.
Could a president hypothetically do that now? Or
you'd need Congress to approve it. Yeah, but like under Obama, the Senate decided we just wouldn't have we had a whole year where we only had 8 because the Senate wouldn't confirm Obama's nominee, which is really immoral if you ask me, but yeah. But it was a big victory for the Republicans because they ended up getting a lot more power on the Supreme Court. That's like the thing that the greatest accomplishment of the Trump administration thus far. If you see conservative justices as a good thing, he's changed the court system in a lot of ways that's going to have ramifications forever. Okay, Key terms. You guys get voluntarism? You get the New Deal?
Yes.
Keynesian economics?
More or less.
Yeah, that's a rough one, but still the idea that we have to spend a bunch of money to help the government has to spend money.
That was probably really unpopular, right?
No, people were ready for something new, and Roosevelt was able to explain it. Again, if you can persuade people that it's okay, and he was persuasive. Try to look at the chapter. A way to organize your thoughts with all this information thrown at you is relief, reform, recovery. Right? Two things that kids always struggle with. One is some kids try to memorize every little acronym. Don't do that, but have an idea of be able to talk about one in each category. Yeah. And the text talks about the second New Deal. So it's like, because the text tries to stay chronological, and there was something called the Second New Deal. But really, in the big scheme of things, it's all just one big New Deal. The whole entire Roosevelt administration, except the parts that happened overseas in World War II, are the New Deal. So just call it all the New Deal. There are some changes halfway along the way, but don't get stressed over that, because this textbook is the only textbook that I've ever seen that does that. Yes. I think that's it. I'm going to have to refilm some if you'd like to watch it again. Anybody have questions? Cooper.
So no one liked Hoover, and because of this, a lot of people liked Roosevelt, or were there people who didn't like Roosevelt?
There were people who didn't like Roosevelt, people who thought that he was too... so there were some people who opposed Roosevelt. One of them was Huey Long. There's a picture of him over there with those radio... with the microphones in front of him. He was a senator from Louisiana who thought that he called Roosevelt dictatorial, even though he was more dictatorial. He kind of came at Roosevelt from the left and thought that Roosevelt didn't understand ordinary people. There were people, Father Coughlin, who was a radio guy, also opposed Roosevelt. The Republican Party was decimated during the 1930s because of the popularity of Roosevelt and the unpopularity of Hoover. Yes. Yeah. Who else? And by the time, well, yeah, that's in the next chapter. Anything else? Thank you so much. Having you guys here made this a lot easier for me. I appreciate it. I'm going to turn off the camera now. At least I hope I am. I wonder how far that first one got.